I think before we move into the next session, which is on professionalization in the state and private sector, I'd like to, I think it's a very important conversation, and I have no doubt that the panel will be sharing with us the holistic approach around this matter, where, all too often we find ourselves getting stuck with the notion of professionalization only being around registering with a professional body. And what we need to do is maybe as a society look at how might we inculcate those behavioral traits in our communities, in our basic education programs, so that it's more about the behavior and the professional registration being then just the cherry on the top. Because certainly even without those institutions, it's important that in all workplaces, in all environments, that people be aware of their roles in society and have those appropriate attitudes and behaviors. We have to get beyond the notion of, so I ask somebody for directions, and they look at me and they say to themselves, so what's in it for me? So without further ado, I'm now going to welcome the facilitator for this session, Naomi Naidu. Naomi is a professionally registered civil engineer at Pink Africa Consulting Engineers, which she founded in 2016. Her responsibilities at the business owner extends beyond the technical engineering aspects and includes a full spectrum of management related to HR, financing, bidding, marketing, compliance, and she actively manages and mentors junior staff and is avidly involved in industry structures, including CESA and CESA. She is also a CESA board member. So Naomi, over to you, and please take us through the next session with your group of eminent panelists. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to session 5, which, as Chris mentioned, talks about the professionalization in the state and private sector. So the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are a collective of 17 interlinked global goals designed to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. These goals were adopted by the United Nations in 2015 as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that by 2030, all people enjoy peace and prosperity. These goals do emphasize the need for all citizens to have a right to clean water, dignified sanitation systems, safe access to electricity, communication systems, and safe transport systems, among others. I think it's quite evident that infrastructure acts as a support system to a sustainable economy. The National Development Plan recognizes that South Africa needs to maintain and expand its electricity, water, transport, and telecommunications infrastructure in order to support economic growth and social development goals in the medium and long term. So, what is the current state of infrastructure delivery in South Africa? Are infrastructure funds spent effectively for improved service delivery? And are we on track with meeting our medium and long-term goals as set out in the National Development Plan? In so answering this, I just want to state how South Africa is set up. So in South Africa, the government is the main catalyst for infrastructure delivery. The government's involvement is largely centered around infrastructure planning, operations and maintenance, procurement of suitable service providers, SMME development and implementation of policies to enable infrastructure development, amongst other roles. It is also important to note that there are various other role players required to work together with government to achieve infrastructure delivery. And these are our private sector service providers, like the professional engineers, the community, who are the benefactors, investors, and politicians. So going back to our question about infrastructure funds being spent effectively for improved service delivery. A large number of municipalities report infrastructure underspending each year. In addition, many municipalities face operational and financial challenges. The Auditor General's report on municipalities for the 2018-2019 financial year produced a very dire picture, stating that only of the 278 municipalities in the country achieved a clean audit, while 28 municipalities did not submit their reports by the due date. Some of the issues coming through from the AG report are wasteful and irregular expenditure, improper procurement processes, poor adherence to financial controls, poor asset management, a high rate of vacancies in key positions, poor project monitoring, high levels of non-compliance with legislation governing municipal finance and accounting processes. Of course, these issues do not apply to all South African municipalities. In fact, we see a number of very efficiently run municipalities that are even winning international awards. So this is in no wise a blanket statement to government, but the AG's report does highlight the need for critical skills and technical capacity within the states employed to ensure proper management of state funds and efficient management within the various departments. The good news is that there are steps currently being taken in the right direction. Public Service and Administration Minister Senzo Mchunu has appointed a task team to assist government through the National School of Government, known as the NSG, to finalize the national implementation framework towards the professionalization of the public service. This followed the cabinet approval of the publication of the draft framework in December 2020. At CESA, we completely support this process and look forward to working together with the state in achieving the required goals as set out in the National Development Plan. In this session, we have four very knowledgeable speakers from various sectors in the industry who will unpack issues currently affecting the rollout of infrastructure projects, specifically in line with the professionalization within the state. There is definitely a need to identify short and long-term solutions to address this issue. The short-term solutions should address government's need to upskill, but we also need to look at long-term solutions, which would be implementing skills transfer as a pipeline to professionals in the state. And this solution should also include transformational processes that address the race and gender inequalities in the industry, as we have seen a number of issues that have come through from the previous session as well. So in this session, we plan on looking at possible solutions and also identifying opportunities that we can all get involved in from the various sectors to attain excellent service delivery, and in so doing, embrace professionalism and sustainability in solving social problems, not just limited to crime and the triple challenge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So before we move on to our first speaker, just a reminder to put in any questions that you have as the speakers go along in the Q&A box on the side of your screen. So our first speaker is Dr. Florencia Belvedere. She is the lead in the State Reform Program in the Public Affairs Research Institute. She will be covering professionalization in this public sector from a researcher's perspective. So Dr. Belvedere joined the Public Affairs Research Institute, known as PARI, as a program consultant leading the State Reform Program. She holds a BA in Political Science from the University of North Carolina in the USA, a PhD in Political Science from the University of Minnesota in the USA, and an LLB from the University of South Africa. She is an admitted attorney in South Africa. Prior to joining PARI, Belvedere was a public servant in the South African government for 8 years and also worked in civil society organizations focusing on asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants. Her area of work includes refugee and migrant rights, land rights, administration law, labor law, and child protection. And we have heard Dr. Ferencia previously as on one of CESA sessions, and we're really glad to have her again on at the CESA Indaba, and we look forward to contributions that she will make today. Over to you, Dr. Valvadia.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Extremely grateful to be here and sharing this platform with brilliant colleagues. Very glad to be back with CESA. We do share another platform, as you mentioned in your introduction, which is being part of the ministerial task team that is looking to finalize the framework to professionalize the public service. So without further ado, if that's okay, I'm going to share my presentation. I just wanted first to just give a little bit of background very quickly about what PARI is all about, because we did hear Chris Campbell talking about how do we change also behavioral traits and how do we instill a particular sense of integrity as part of that professionalization that we always talk about. And for us, a lot of the work that PARI does is directly linked to this, right? To support the development of a more effective and accountable state so that that state can support the society economically and socially. And our focus is on state institutions in service delivery and infrastructure. And our key mode of talking about these things is through research. And so for us, the focus is much more on structural dynamics. So not so much on the short-term quick fixes, but thinking about what are the bigger picture things that we need to change. And we work with the public service, change agents in the public service, and with civil society to improve implementation of policies and to advocate certainly for changes to legislation, to systems, to policies, and to enhance and to think about how to deal with particular governance challenges. So, and the program that I lead, we have been focusing primarily on developing concrete proposals to improve the public procurement system, which I think we've discussed with CESA colleagues before, as well as the professionalization of the public sector with a focus on the issues around recruitment, selection, and removal. And so what I'm going to talk about is linked to that work that PARI has undertaken. And I also just want to give you a broader view of what are some of the initiatives. As Naomi was saying, what are the things that are happening? Because there is certainly a realization from the part of the state that something needs to give. We've seen enough malfeasance, we've seen enough wastage and leaks, and therefore there's a need to take, so to speak, the bull by the horns and start dealing with some of these fundamental issues. So the Department of Public Service and Administration, some of you might know, is engaged in what they call an optimization project. And is trying to deal with these issues, right, that we hear about. Fragmented government, we've got very bad service delivery, or is not integrated enough. Then we've got a rising wage bill, and we still need the concerns about efficiency while also retaining people. And then the fact that a lot of people are losing trust in the state that is meant to deliver. And so that project has 5 work streams, and 2 of them deal predominantly with issues around professionalization. One of them has to do with human rights, sorry, not human rights, that's my background. Human resource development, strategies and plans, and focuses on issues of skill audits, recruitment processes. And then the other pillar of it, or work stream, deals specifically with professionalization, trying to deal with this issue of the political administrative interface, which is something that PARI takes quite seriously, and the focus on building skills and capacity. So if we think about the draft national framework that Naomi mentioned just now, it falls squarely under that professionalization work stream. And as mentioned already, it was published for public comment in December 2020, and it's aligned with the National Development Plan, and also the medium-term strategic framework of government, in terms of really starting to do really put the meat on the bones of what we need by what we mean by building a capable state. And that framework has 5 pillars. You can read them from the screen. I think it's recruitment and selection for us is critical, certainly induction and onboarding. There's planning and performance management, continuous learning, and then career progression and career incidences. And some of the strengths of the framework, I mean, certainly the fact that there is a recognition that we need to professionalize and that we need to insulate the public service from inappropriate political interference is definitely a welcome step. And therefore, we're willing to work with government to make sure that this indeed becomes a reality. So there are a number of measures that have been instituted, such as pre-entry exams for members of the senior management, induction, ongoing training. There's this concept of allowing also public servants to gain experience through rotated into the private sector, which could be quite interesting, I think, for CESA to think about. Meritocracy as a key component in recruitment, and then building the relationship with and partnerships with professional bodies, certification, and also training to be provided through those bodies or entities. And then the idea, the focus on consequence management, particularly in relation to the amendments of the Public Audit Amendment Act. So those are some of the strengths of that framework. Now, some of the weaknesses is that it's very input driven, right? We know that all of these things are going to be implemented and are being put in place, but how do we actually translate that into having an impact on service delivery? There isn't a sense of how that process is going to be undertaken, even though it is meant to be an implementation framework. Also, performance and consequence management, I think, are treated in a very cursory fashion. And you actually need that. As much as you want the incentives and the emphasis on ethical conduct and integrity, you also need to play the role of monitoring, making sure that people do adhere to those standards. And you said examples of people who might not. And then we find that there is definitely a lack of detail on kind of the short, medium, and longer term interventions that the framework says it will provide, but it really doesn't. It's very forward looking about who do we bring in, but there aren't a lot of measures to deal with what do we do now, because we've got to govern now, and we've got to govern with integrity, and we've got to make sure that the state contributes to economic growth and service delivery now. And I think for us at PARI is recognition that the conduct, as much as we might want to build ethical conduct and emphasize ethical conduct, that conduct is powerfully framed, constrained, and enabled by the structures of the institutions within which officials operate. And that structuration of the state has significant consequences. And for us, that's always been the focus at PARI. So I think some of the opportunities for influence where we have tried to put forward our proposals has been through oral submissions and written submissions on that framework, which I'm sure CESA participated in, and also the ministerial task team. Like we said, it's been established, and their role is to take forward the proposals in the framework and take the submissions that were made publicly, and also based on their own expertise and knowledge, finalize that framework in many ways. So PARI and CESA both sit on the task team. If I'm not mistaken, Chris Campbell is there officially from CESA. PARI is there as a representative of civil society. And we certainly have been quite active in ensuring that we contribute not only to issues of recruitment, but issues around performance, issues around the role of the National School of Government, so that indeed this framework can be taken forward. I think some of the key proposals, I'm going to run very quickly because of time. In a nutshell, what we advocate, particularly in relation to processes of recruitment and personnel practices, is that we have to have a system of tiered screens, what we call tiered screens. that disaggregation of duties between people who plan the process of recruitment, people who administer it, and then people who actually select and appoint. And this starts at the highest level. And certainly we call on the Public Service Commission as a Chapter 10 institution in terms of the Constitution to be a vital check and balance on this process, and usually playing a key role in administrative processes. And then calling for the Public Service Commission, whether it is at the level of DGs and the head of the public service, as we'll mention just now, that they actually play a key role in also setting up committees with the necessary expertise to make sure that the people that are actually shortlisted and from whom a president or a minister might select are people that actually indeed have the necessary skills and qualifications. And that level of kind of subject matter expertise to be brought on provides a level of safeguard against that political interference that a lot of times has trumped merit in many instances. I think, so we've got a number of proposals that we will be publishing actually in terms of as a digital book very shortly, and we will make CESA aware of that. So you can look at this, what we talk about, this basic model in more detail. I don't have the time to go into it, but basically is based on this idea of having committees that allow for that level of expertise that might not be found in current selection committees in government, and to create that space from insulating it from undue political interference. I think also we keep talking about integrity and competency tests. That should not be a once-off issue. Usually it's seen as, do you meet these tests upon recruitment? But it should be an ongoing thing, because you might have integrity when you started, but as you go along, that might not be the case. And also, I think it's been recognized the need for competency tests to be undertaken now to make sure that people in the public service that are public servants do indeed have the minimum requirements for the positions that they hold, and to take measures to actually deal with it. Because we really cannot afford to have people who don't meet those requirements at the moment. And certainly, HR departments also have a key role to play in identifying critical skills required for particular jobs and working with the National School of Government so that there's specialized programs to enhance the capacity and the skills and knowledge of those categories. I think also we're supportive of this idea of professionalizing key professions and key categories of employees, and then being certified by professional bodies. But not just that, I think there's very much a need to continue not just the registration, you fill in the form and you pay your fee, but really to continue that training and even some of that assessment to make sure that people indeed, even though on paper they might have a particular qualification, that they can actually apply it and do it with integrity and the necessary knowledge. There is something in the framework, and maybe CESA colleagues can talk more about it, but there's a lot of discussion about aligning performance management with professional bodies and association registration, and how that could be done. Again, this would be an issue whether there could be more regular assessments to make sure that people have the necessary skills, and also maybe to enhance those skills. I think we're also supportive of issues around implementing financial disclosures, as the Public Administration Management Act proposes for people who are in supply chain and finance, and that also procurement processes, even though this is really not about procurement, but certainly we got to rethink this idea of generalist bid committees, and really bringing on board people with the necessary expertise, sometimes end user divisions that have indeed the necessary knowledge to be able to assess some of these bids. So very quickly, there have been also some important amendments to both the Public Service Act and the Public Administration Management Act, or PAMA. And there is this attempt, again, to start separating the political from the administrative. So the Public Service amendments seek to devolve powers to the heads of department while keeping much more the strategic focus on the executive authority. And also and it's moving closer to this idea also found in the National Development Plan of creating what they call a super DG, or a head of the public service. And it's envisioned that this would be the DG in the presidency, to be able to be kind of more, have oversight over DGs. The Public Administration Management Act also there's attempts to give effect to this idea of a single public service that we always talk about, standardizing conditions of service, also facilitating the rotation. If you've got very capable people in the national sphere, that those individuals will be able to be deployed to other spheres, for instance, local government levels, particularly, so that one can strengthen, even if it is maybe not forever, but certainly use people who are already capacitated to be able to enhance what is missing maybe in other areas or other divisions or particular departments. So those are proposed amendments. There's also provisions to tighten this idea of doing business with the state, particularly where employees are directors of companies that conduct business with the state. I think for us, the concern is that in some cases, employees might not be directors of such companies, but they're the ultimate beneficiaries of the contracts that are entered into. And therefore, this brings into question issues about beneficial ownership, which are quite critical in South Africa, and where we need to do much more so that we are able to gather information on who are the beneficial owners or the holders of shares of companies that do business with the state. So like I said, the amendments haven't been adopted yet, but we expect them to be coming soon. I think lastly, the one aspect that I want to highlight, and I'm sure my colleagues from the National School of Government that are on the platform will also speak to this, but two encouraging things. Certainly, the amendments also bring emphasis on the establishment of the Public Administration Ethics, Integrity and Disciplinary Technical Assistance Unit within the DPSA. Is a very long name. It has been there all along, but there was an official launch by Minister Glodlo very recently, as part of Public Service Month. And this is focused on improving kind of implementation of ethics and anti-corruption policy, giving effect to this idea of the ethics infrastructure that is already in legislation about having departments, having ethics committees, ethics officers, providing protection to whistleblowers and how to do the whistleblowing. And also this issue of discipline management, building capacity and addressing the outstanding, cases. Like I didn't mention in my previous slide, but I think over the past two financial years, about 4.5 billion rands has been paid to public servants who are waiting for their cases to be finalized. So we really need to deal with that. That's a huge leakage. And one encouraging thing that only happened yesterday, some of you might be aware, is that a group of former directors general, about 40 of them from the first and second administrations, have decided to come together in the form of a voluntary association to support government in building a capable state. So the idea is not looking for work in that sense, but rather be there as a sounding board, as an advisory group to say, this might work, this might not work. Keep their integrity, keep their independence, to be able to say, to be able to dissent with government and not being seen as a part of government. And the other civil society initiatives, I think, where we can continue to make an impact is we have started with a number of organizations. PARI is part of a public procurement reform working group, which we hope CESA will join. We also are part of the Defend Our Democracy campaign, which is calling for a number of these, the push for professionalization. And we're also part of the civil society working group on state capture, where we are also keeping a very close eye on the report from the Zondo Commission, because we are sure that given the I think, very sobering testimony that we've heard over the last 2-3 years, that there will be critical recommendations to make in terms of how to professionalize the public service. So that's what I've got for you. I want to thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take any more questions, any questions when the time comes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Balmudia. I think there was a really amazing presentation. It's so refreshing to see that there are things being done and that there is a task force driving this process and addressing the shortfalls identified. You've given us a great deal of information and touched on so many critical key issues, many of which has probably been frustrating a number of us at the moment. And I'm glad to see that there are steps being taken to address these. I do look forward to seeing the impact of the program as it is being implemented. And I think you raised an important point about building relationships with various bodies. As we know, this is how we make things better. It's by helping each other achieve this common goal that we have. So thank you very much for your time. Also, just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can put it in the Q&A box on the side, and you do have the option of being anonymous if you feel that your questions might be controversial, but please do add your question. Okay, so now we've got our next speaker, who's Mr. Edwin Baloyi. He is the president of the South African Black Technical and Allied Careers Organization, known as SAPTACO, and he'll be speaking on building a capable state and service delivery in responsive private sectors from a professional engineering practitioner's perspective and SAPTACO perspective. Mr. Baloyi ascended to the highest office at SAPTACO during the elective congress that took place in May of 2021. Mr. Baloyi is currently employed by the Mpumalanga Department of Public Works, Roads and Transport Department as the Director for Roads Design and Materials Subdirectorate. He started working at the department in December 2019, and prior to this, he was a founder and director of a civil engineering company, which he started in 2014. Mr. Baloyi, we are glad to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. First and foremost, what I did was to actually look at the professionalism in terms of definition. Now, we are seeing that the National Implementation Framework towards the professionalization of public service, it makes an important distinction between being professional and professionalism. Professional is relating to or belonging to a profession, while professionalism, which are practices, conducts, values, and behavior regardless of training, qualifications, and levels of responsibility. According to the framework, professionalizing also means having qualified people who know what they are doing and are fully equipped to perform their duties or their job with diligence. This entails continuous development, which makes public servants more competitive by sharpening their know-how. Now, as we continue, I then realized that before maybe one can be able to continue talking about this topic, we're definitely going to have to look at the background. Now, in my background, I mentioned that the talks about, or the discussions about professionalization, especially that of the private sector, or the public sector rather, does not start today. There are a number of discussion documents that have been issued over the years, which were developed in order to zoom into the matter and possible solutions to this matter. As an example, I've got Government Gazette number 44031, which was issued on the 24th of December 2020. I think the previous speaker made mention of that, which has got a heading, a national implementation framework towards the professionalization of the public service. This is one of those documents that have been issued to highlight issues of this topic, though its focus is purely on public sector. As a background again, I'm saying in December 2018, the Public Service Commission issued out a document titled Report on the Roundtable on the Professionalization of the Public Service in South Africa. This document was also meant to look at the same issue that is being discussed today. From this submission, one will then realize that the problem actually lies in the implementation plan because ideas are there but are not tested. As we continue then, under my background, I say we then have to look at the historic background in terms of where we're coming from as a country. Now, historically, from the apartheid era, South Africa never practiced what we call meritocracy, where it comes to issues of appointing government employees, especially on high salary level positions, because that is where decisions are made. In many ways than one, senior managers come with a bucket list of people to be employed at lower levels. And this is a historic event. The apartheid government was also divided based on colonial balkanization of South Africa into the former Transvaal, Orange Free State, Natal, and Cape Colony. The apartheid regime also resulted in the ethnic balkanization, which resulted in the creation of Bantustans and self-governing territories. As I continue my background, then I also make mention that the common practice was that whites were appointed in the private sector, and those that could not be accommodated in the former British colonies will be placed in the Bantustans or self-governing territories. In fact, in the early 90s, at the dawn of democracy, the senior management in the administration of Bantustans and self-governing territories comprised of white officials who could not make it in the full administration of the British colonies. Black officials that were appointed in the senior position within the Bantustan government were also not appointed on merit, but rather based on royal lineage. Now, under best practices, I'm saying it is unfortunate that as a member of South African community, my views do not matter, and the same criticism cannot be leveled against the private sector, due to the monopoly practices of the business owners and or directors. The private sector is not governed by the South African Constitution or any bylaws which regulates how businesses should be run in the public sector in terms of appointing or appointments of employees. The professionalization and performance of a private company serves the interest of the private company. Having said that above though, it is worth mentioning that the private sector must be ethical in their business operations, as that will determine their continuous business opportunities or lack of. Their professionalization or their professionalism contribute in putting the country on a map, either as a country with best or bad infrastructure. It is for this reason that private sector should also practice meritocracy and pay people based on experience and not necessarily who they are. Now, we observed that companies doing business with the state, they continue to suffer the consequences by merely doing businesses with the state because lack of professionalism results in poor planning and implementation of services, especially in the state. Service providers are paid very late, and there seems to be no consequence management to resolve the problem and protect it from happening further. The public sector is a highly politicized and unionized. Employees who are not performing are protected by unions, and as a result, they are protected from being faced with punitive measures. Our views on the topic is that whilst SAPTACO welcomes the professionalization of the private and public sector, this cannot be done at the compromise of transformation and advancement of Black professionals in the built environment. This is at the backdrop of the assumption that professionalism is associated with white professionals and non-professionalism is associated with Black professionals, which is unfortunate because all professionals are awarded their professional status by the same accrediting body. This is an issue about public sector being highly politicized, but there is silence about private sector appointments being based on cronyism and non-compliance to transformation objectives. As we continue, SAPTACO's view is that private and public sectors must have a pool of professionally registered individuals, then professionalism will be an automatic outcome. professionals must be encouraged to training and register with their respective professional councils. For example, EXA, SACPCMP. And these councils also must conduct the best practices to all candidates. As per definition, we encourage having qualified people in our employment. Both sectors must have employees who know what they are doing and are fully equipped to perform their jobs with diligence. This entails continuous development, which makes public servants more competitive by sharing their know-how. You cannot talk professionalism without addressing developments to develop skills. How does one develop skill in a professional space, if not by qualification, access to job opportunities, mentoring, training on the job, and CPD attendance? Now, as I conclude and putting a way forward, we are saying that organizations like SAPTACO and CESA must join hands in providing opportunities to train young professionals and be intentional about the effort. The public sector must be deliberate in their appointments of professional service providers by ensuring that they include clauses to train the internal and external graduates. Professional service providers who are mainly doing private work must be encouraged to employ Black graduates and professionals. Young professionals in training must be paid in accordance to their level of education, other than being paid a lot of money under OSD and be paid less than what they used to get during their training once they are appointed permanently. This happens especially in the public sector. Now, we're saying, as the last bullet point there, that professionalization of the private and public sector must be treated as a work in progress. Therefore, continuous engagements must be done to improve the status quo, and once taken, discussions must be implemented for the benefit of the end users. And by so saying, I want to say, Nakensa, thank you, Rikorivua, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Beloy. I thank you for that presentation and for highlighting what is actually involved in professionalism as a whole. And it isn't just a once-off aspect, but rather a continuous process. And I'm glad that you also mentioned that part of the solution to professionalization is inclusive of the entire transformation process, which goes hand in hand. And mentoring and training aspects are critical. This needs to be incorporated at all levels. I think that also leads to another question of the fee aspect and discounting, and how do we incorporate all this, where all that's required with the discount moment, and that later on in the program. But thank you very much for your presentation. Our next speaker is Mrs. Zinat Gul, who is the CEO of Aspire Consulting, and she'll be talking on professionalization in the private sector from a consulting engineer's perspective. Mrs. Zinat Gul is the founder, director, and CEO of Aspire Consulting Engineers. Mrs. Zinat Gul is the founder, director, and CEO of Aspire Consulting Engineers. Aspire is a consulting engineering company and one of the member firms of CESA. Zinat graduated at UCT in 2005 and joined the workforce in the City of Gold. After working in various sectors from public and private sector and having experience in both civil and structural projects over an 8-year period, she left formal employment to start her own business in 2015. Zinat has worked on many prestigious buildings in South Africa, including the Oprah Winfrey School, Steyn City, Clubhouse, Gautrain Viaducts, and has gained valuable experience throughout a professional career. Zinat has grown her business from 2015 to present and has increased her staff base considerably. She has successfully completed over 200 projects from its inception. She has been nominated for various awards, including being finalist in the CESA Women-Led Business category, Manara Chamber of Commerce Business Awards, and the SAIBPP Awards. She has been awarded the winner of the Standard Bank Top Co Awards in 2019. During the last year, she's made headway in a predominantly, last few years, she's made headway in a predominantly male industry, whilst changing the narrative around what engineering is. Her motto is to lead engineering solutions collaboratively and be less of a consulting engineer and more of a consultant. This is exactly what we want to see in the industry if we want to see change. Thank you so much, Janet, for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
As Naomi mentioned, I am the founder of Aspire Consulting Engineers and currently the CEO. And our topic of discussion is professionalization in the private sector. Mr. Buleo gave us a very insightful presentation just now with real key issues and the real challenges with regards to past issues that are now presenting itself in the current situation we find ourselves in. So professionalization in the private sector is a lot easier for a lot of the reasons that he has mentioned in terms of how we run our business and how we're not ruled by processes and those sorts of challenge. Professionalization typically means the actions or the processes of giving an occupation, activity, or group professional qualities, typically by increasing training and raising required qualifications. And that's broadly what I'm going to speak about in terms of the private sector and how we do that. I made a little timesheet in terms of the life cycle of an engineer or technician or technologist. And it's basically just to highlight the various things. If we go back to the previous slide, it's talking about increasing training. And how you get to be an engineer or technician or technologist is very much about the training that you get. So I said, when you're a little bambino, you're playing Duplos, you're making forts, you're making little houses with your giant Lego blocks. You then become a toddler, you're building forts from pillows and blankets and whatever else you can find in your home. You then become a child and you get these fancy Legos that you now build masterpieces from the Taj Mahal to bridges. It's incredible. We then do 12 years of schooling. Okay, 12 years of schooling when I was in school. Nowadays, you have to do 14 years of school. You then go to university for 4 years or 5 years, depending on technicians and technologists and getting some work experience. You then graduate and you become an engineer, you become a technologist. When you do that, you enter the workforce where you have to apply the rules, you have to follow the codes, and you live your dream of becoming an engineer. And at that point in time, you've had a significant amount of training and expertise to get you where you need to be. The next part of that is really about the 4 items that Mr. Buleo also raised, which is, I just made some notes here because I thought those were very valuable, where it's about job entry, where it's about CPD. So qualification I spoke about, which was the first one. The next one is once you get your qualification, you have to get access to jobs. That has been a real challenge for graduates that have graduated in the last 2 to 3 years because they actually haven't been able to find work. So not only do they have these grand expectations of going to campus, graduating, getting to the other side, but then they face the reality of not being able to actually find work. Once they get to work, there's another challenge, and that's actually finding suitable mentorship. If you don't have somebody that's going to take you under your wing, senior engineers, senior managers, that can teach you and show you the ropes, then unfortunately you are going to be at a disadvantage. And then once you have the qualification, the access to jobs, the mentorship, it's about further development, which is through your CPD courses, where you continue to learn, because life is constantly about learning. So we spoke about, and it's pretty much the same thing that that was touched on earlier, which is basically the emergence of a full-time occupation, the establishment of a training school, founding of professional associations, policy aligned to professionalization, and the adoption of a formal code. Within our engineering sector, it's obviously there's been a lot of definition in terms of the codes that we use, the practices that we follow, best practices, our code of ethics that we follow. So there's been a lot of formal code that has been implemented that we need to live by to continue to maintain our professionalization of the industry. Professionalization is whereby a trade occupation transforms itself into a true profession of the highest integrity and competence. This process tends to involve establishing acceptable qualifications, a professional body or association to oversee and regulate the affairs and the conduct of the member of the profession. As engineers, we have to exhibit the highest standards of honesty and integrity. We have to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Engineers must perform under standard of professional behavior that requires adherence to the highest principle of ethical conduct. And when you do your registration and you do your graduations and you do all of these items that you do, what holds very near to us and dear to us is our EXA code of conduct and our EXA code of ethics, where these items are highlighted, because you cannot be an engineer without these items. It's how we live our life every day in our profession. It's the codes we design to, the code of ethics we live with, our purpose on this planet, the testing we do, and the best practices. It's about standing up for what's right. It's about objecting to what's wrong. It's a simple thing like seeing that manhole cover open when it's not really your sight and standing up for what's safe and beneficial to all of humanity, because it becomes our collective responsibility of how we want to live our life. So I mentioned briefly about governing bodies. There's EXA, that's a governing body. There's voluntary associations, CESA, and all the engineering associations we belong to. There's the SANS codes that we design to from every single element in terms of testing, in terms of implementation, in terms of design. It's the EXA code of conduct that we study and we live by. It's how we do quality management system, whether you're ISO accredited or how you actually run your business. And what's all the fuss really about? The fuss really about is how to improve. And that's the purpose of how to be better than you can be. And why do you want to be better? Because you should just be the best that you can be. I know it sounds a bit fluffy to say, let's just be the best that we can be. And I know coming from the private sector, it's very different to being in a space where you're governed by certain policies and lots of rules and hierarchy. In a private sector where I am the boss, it's a lot easier to say, how do you actually bring professionalization to your sector? And how can you actually be the best that you want to be? So I spoke a little bit about what the process is in terms of professionalization, but what does it actually mean in terms of your application? So professionalization, like we said, is just about really being the best that you can be and bringing processes and that sort of thing. So individuals, and this is what I try to teach our graduates and our staff, is about how do you be a professional and how do you look and present and what sort of processes are those? For me, it's about doing good presentations. Your presentation speaks about you when you cannot. The visual aid really brings a professional element to it. Write reports that answer all the questions. Show up early always. Be neat and be presentable. Live your value in the way you speak, in the way you dress, and in the way you deliver. Have processes that work. Be inspirational and be impeccable with your word. Those already give you a lot of credibility. And in this industry, especially, I speak to a lot of graduates. And I always ask them, what sets you apart? And for me, these items really set you apart because it shows that you're next level. In consulting practices like ours, we obviously, like it was mentioned earlier, we have a lot of leeway in terms of how we do things. We don't have to really answer, and we're not governed by the same thing that public sector is governed by, which makes it a lot easier. It makes it a lot easier to have processes that you want. You choose the software that you want. You choose how you want to implement it. You choose when you start work. You choose when you end work. I think the big difference between private sector and public sector is really just about the processes that you can employ and also how you run your business. So we are obviously governed by making a profit, delivering services, but also making money from it. And we run our business as a business, where public sector doesn't necessarily run their business as a business. We can define our visions and our missions that we want to live by, and we dictate the terms for that. So what I said in terms of practical applications for consulting practices, private consulting practices, is processes are really important. As long as you make sure what it is that you want to achieve, and the easiest way to do that is by having a vision and a mission that you live by. I said, be honest about what it is that it is. Employees can smell that a mile away. You want to present a certain way, but live what you're actually saying, because honesty and integrity, like I mentioned in the first slide, is a paramount of importance, not only as engineers, but also as human beings. Teach and learn simultaneously. We can all learn if we want to. You can't say that you can't learn from somebody that's a junior. You can't say that you can learn from somebody that's inferior in terms of your education. And if you have that arrogance, then you won't learn. So be open and able to learn from everyone. Check, and check again. That's very important. Quality is the utmost importance. So it comes back to your processes in terms of what quality you want, whether you're going to implement ISO accreditation to maintain your quality standards, or whether you just have your own internal quality management systems. Align your staff to your way of thinking. If it resonates with them, then you have a win. Set realistic expectations, communication is key, and have a purpose that makes sense. Further items in terms of consulting practices are the things that Chris had mentioned earlier with regards to Naomi, how she does the staff and the HR. Those elements are so important in the business. I always say consulting engineering is 20% of our business, and the rest of it is how you actually run your business. From the financial elements, how you plan your software, how you plan your tax, your VAT, how you plan salaries, those sort of elements need to be up to date and constantly ticking over from month to month. Staff and resource planning. Know what your staff are and what your resources are available, and align that to your projects. You have to keep your staff busy, and when they're not busy, an idle mind is a devil's playground. So in times where, like COVID, maybe business wasn't so busy, teach them to get advanced in terms of software that they're learning something or implementing a best practice. Project plan. There's so many tools available nowadays. It's amazing. It simplifies how you project plan. So keep up to date with what software is available and how you implement it in your business. And make sure that it streamlines and it's available to all, and it has a nice interface so that people are keen to then use it. Management of project and funds. There's cash flow management. There's HR management. There's allocation of funds for certain works. So often in private sector, the downside of being in private sector is we're expected to do a lot of risk work. And when you do work at risk, then obviously you're not getting paid for it. So it's just about how you manage that so that you don't have to get into a situation where you need to do cost cutting or staff cutting and that sort of thing. But it all comes back to how your processes work and what your flow is and what you ultimately want to achieve. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I know that in a private sector, it is a lot easier. We have a lot less terms in terms of processes and that sort of thing. There are barriers to entry within the private sector where Edwin mentioned earlier about chommies and how you get work. But it's about like overcoming these nuances. I think that a lot of time we focus on issues in the past that have created the situation that we find ourselves in. But as long as we come together and we have a shared vision in terms of professionalization, not only of the private sector, but of the public sector as well, and how we work together, where it's sharing of staff and training programs and internships and those sorts of things, where you can teach the lessons that people have spent so much time perfecting, so that you can ultimately work towards the better good of the country as a whole, because private needs public and public needs private. So I think it's about recognizing that and working together. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Zinat. And you've highlighted so many critical gaps, like lack of jobs and lack of proper mentorship. And I think the highlight of it was that this is our collective responsibility. And we're not just here to complain about issues, but rather identify these gaps and improve where we can. And your distinction between the private and public sector was spot on. Private sector, we concerned about the business and also identifying risk and making sure that we are in the clear and we've nailed this down. And public sector has a whole different end goal. In addition, they have a lot more limitations in terms of their policies, and then there's also the hereditary and political issues that come through. And I think ultimately, as you very clearly stated in the end, we have to find a way of addressing these issues together and aligning our goals with government so that we can, private and government can work together to achieve the goals that we need to at the end of the day. So thank you so much for your time. Shabelo Mja from the National School of Government, known as the NSG. And he'll be talking on professionalization in the public sector from the NSG's perspective. So Dr. Mja is currently the Deputy Director General at the National School of Government, which is responsible for the review, upgrading, and development of new curricula for training South African public servants in junior, middle, senior, and executive levels in the public service. Mr. Mja has previously worked as the Senior Executive Manager for Labor Market Policy in the Department of Labor and the National Business Initiative, Molteno Project, and the Human Sciences Research Council. He obtained his Doctor of Philosophy degree in Education from the University of the Witwatersrand on a thesis titled South African Urban Black Youth Capacity to Aspire. He has conducted research and written extensively in the schooling sector, higher education sector, and labor market sector, looking at education quality issues and the culture of learning broadly and balancing flexibility with protection of workers in the labor market. Thank you so much, Dr. Mja, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Naomi. We're going to be talking about this framework, but what I'm going to try and do, because Dr. Belvedere and Mr. Baloyi, I think, have done an excellent job in summarizing the national implementation framework towards the professionalization of the public sector. So I don't want to repeat everything they've said. I'm going to do what in hip hop they call freestyling. So I'm going to try and freestyle so that I don't just repeat what they've said. This framework, firstly, arises in a context of the challenges that we face as a country. If you go to slide number 5, we came up with the National Development Plan arising from the diagnostic overview that was done in 2011. Now, the diagnostic review and the plan itself, the NDP, gave us targets and objectives that we must achieve by the year 2030. This year is the year 2021. So it means we have 9 years to go to achieve what is in the National Development Plan, to solve the problems that the diagnostic overview of 2011 said we must solve. Now, in December last year, Bloomberg, which is a respected international news agency, economics agency, in December last year, Bloomberg predicted that by the year 2030, South Africa will be a failed state. This is what Bloomberg said in December last year. This was even way before the civil unrest that we experienced as a country in July this year. So we are in a race against what Bloomberg has predicted, because we identified problems ourselves in 2011, and we said we will have solved them and we will have seen results of those resolutions by the year 2030 in 9 years' time. And Bloomberg says in 9 years' time we will be a failed state. That is the context within which we are trying to intervene and to see what we can do. Now, the second point I'd like to make is that we then looked at international literature in the next slide. You will see that we then looked around in slide number 8 onwards, where we were comparing what have other countries done to try and professionalize their public sector. We looked at China, we looked at India, we looked at South Korea, and we looked at a number of countries. And there are a number of things that came up, some of which were mentioned by Dr. Belvedere and Mr. Baloy. For example, the issue of merit. We said the issue of merit is critical. So we have to have a merit-based system. Here's the thing that I think is important as we have these conversations about professionalizing. We have to acknowledge upfront that professionalizing is one of the interventions that we have to put in place towards achieving the National Development Plan by 2030. So, for instance, do we know, understand, and appreciate the state-society ratio that we have in South Africa? Do we have the sufficient people, numbers, competencies in the state vis-a-vis the ratio of our society? Do we know what our society is constituted of, not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of people? That's the first. Secondly, and Harun Borat from the University of Cape Town, from the DPRU, has done a lot of work on this. Do we have a full appreciation? And I'm raising this because this Indaba is about infrastructure. Do we have a sufficient appreciation of our infrastructure spend ratio in South Africa? Are we spending sufficiently percentage-wise in terms of our GDP on infrastructure, or spending too much or spending less? Because that has implications for the kind of state capacity that you need to have in place in terms of the goals that you have to achieve, not to be a failed state by the year 2030. Thirdly, in terms of what I call our state-society mirror, sometimes, and we avoid these conversations because they are uncomfortable, to which extent is the South African state a reflection and or a mirror of South African society? The things that we see in the state, to which extent do the same things exist in society? Because it will be impossible to resolve issues in the state that we've not been able to resolve in society. And then lastly, we have the three spheres that we talk about. So there is national, there's provincial, there is local government. What is our spend ratio across the three spheres balanced? Or should we be relooking at that for us to be able to achieve our goals by the year 2030? So what I'm saying is that as we talk professionalization of the public sector, we need to do that understanding fully well that it must link up with various other interventions that are central to professionalizing, including issues such as the political administrative interface that Dr. Belvedere was talking about, including issues of examinations and testing that we are proposing, that we should be doing examinations and testing as part of this. So we are saying, when we have professionalized the public sector, what are the things that we will see happen in the state? Firstly, we will see different attitudes and behavior towards serving the public. And of course, remember my earlier point about state-society mirror. When we say we will see changing attitudes and behavior towards serving the public, it has to be that that same public that we are talking about is maybe a different mirror from that which we are not happy about in the state. And if not, we would have to think about what kinds of interventions, concomitant interventions, could be relevant to focus also on the public, the very same public that we are serving. We say it will also mean that we have qualified people who know what they are doing, who are fully equipped and qualified to do that which they've been appointed to do. Of course, we talk about creation of professional categories where they do not exist, but also at the same time, we're talking about partnerships with professional bodies where they exist, so that the work of professionalization is a joint undertaking between the state and the private sector in service of society. Of course, in doing that, we must appreciate the complexity of the public sector. And there will be many instances where that complexity will require of us to think of interventions in a slightly different way. So we would then are suggesting that the issue of having a single public service has to form part of professionalization. The issue of making sure that government is an employer of choice has to be part of professionalization. The issue of making sure that we in South African society and public servants in particular live the commitment of upholding the principles of Batupili that we are all familiar with will have to be central in all of that. Now, we're suggesting 5 key pillars of professionalization, which Dr. Belvedere touched on. And these pillars of professionalization will then run across the value chain. We cannot just professionalize one aspect of the public sector and exclude others. So the value chain is an attempt for us to cover the whole cycle of being a public servant, from pre-entry recruitment and selection all the way to career progression and also career incidents. So we'll have to make sure that not only do we recruit properly, but we also select, and once we've selected, we make sure that there are certain pre-entry requirements. And in doing this, part of the role we expect is that of the education providers, such as your further education and training institutions and your higher education and training institutions, because this point that I was making about the state-society mirror will have to come in as part of the pre-entry conversation. You know, if what is coming out of our institutions is not helping us to professionalize quickly and easier, then the task of professionalization becomes difficult and impossible moving forward. So those that are in these institutions with the intention, hope, or the possibility of being future government officials, future public sector employees, will have to start doing certain things as part of their teaching and learning processes in higher education that will prime them to be as ready as possible when we deal with the pre-entry recruitment and the selection. Of course, we will still induct them because there are certain things we cannot expect higher education and further education to do. So we have an induction program from entry to right at the top DG level and executive level, where we then have to do induction and make sure that everybody is ready to perform their tasks accordingly. We then do planning and performance management, continuing learning and professional development as the 4th layer, and then the last layer would then be focusing on career progression and career incidents. Now, as we're doing all of this, remembering the Bloomberg example that I mentioned, we need to at the same time say to ourselves, what is our understanding of the South African state? Are we very clear as to what are the components, what is the composition, what are the capabilities that are inherent in the South African state? Secondly, we will have to find a way of connecting with our societal foundations. As a country, we've come through apartheid, we've now gone through nearly 30 years of democracy. Are there certain elements of our foundations that we have not attended to and that remain weak? I think July, with the civil unrest, some of us began to experience certain weaknesses in our foundations that we might want to relook at. Because if this state-society mirror that I keep on referring to is not a good reflection, then we have a problem moving forward. What it therefore means in this slide that you can see is that when we have our society in the right place and we want to reflect that in the state, one of the things we must do is this revolving door. Because part of professionalization has to involve those in the private sector periodically coming into the public sector, and those in the public sector periodically going into private sector. Why? We need to feed off each other. We need to learn from each other. There are certain lessons that we learn in public service that private sector can benefit from, and there are certain lessons that private sector can be able to infuse into public sector and allow us to benefit in similar ways going forward. Now, yes, Dr. Belvedere correctly in her critique indicates that there are implementation issues that we have to worry about. We are very conscious of that. The framework, once we've going back to cabinet at the end of this year, we are busy with the consultation. We are really looking forward to inputs from PARI so that we can strengthen the framework when we take it back to cabinet and it is approved. Once it is approved, there are a number of things that we will have to do. One of those things will be critical immediately for us to do is to focus on the senior management service as a start.
Apologies, Doctor. Can I just cut in? Sorry. Just to let you know the time that we're running short a bit of time. So if you could come to conclusion soon, and then we'll move on to the Q&A as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we move forward, we are suggesting we'll have to start with the senior management service and make sure that we professionalize that sector of about 11,000 people and put in interventions, including establishing even a professional body that is targeting senior management service in the public sector. There are a number of other areas that we are looking at, and we hope that the partnerships, for example, whether it be with the engineering sector, whether it be with finance, where there are already professional bodies that exist, those partnerships will allow us to intervene immediately and begin to professionalize quickly so that we are not caught off guard by the year 2030 and the realization from Bloomberg does not happen. I will stop at that. Thank you very much.
I really wish we could have went on longer, but without time limitations, it's not possible. I'd like to invite the other panelists back on screen. Also note that if your question already has been asked by somebody else in the chat, you can vote on it so that it moves up in line. Okay, everyone is here. So just for everyone, we will take question and answers now till 10 past and then close. So sorry, we're just going to cut a little bit into your lunch break. And I'm hoping that the panelists will go through the questions and maybe respond in the chat so that we could still continue the discussion after the session as well. So the first question that has been pushed to the top, would DPSA's employment contracts and code of conduct align with, say, statutory rules and obligations a profession may have? So I think Dr. Belvedere or Dr. Mjar, if you'd like to take this.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, I'm sure Dr. Maja will have a much more detailed response, but I think the idea here is indeed to align. And I think that's why issues around performance management, there is some talk of that, of saying what is required in the profession in terms of how to assess performance. That's why I was saying that role, I think it's critically important in terms of meeting kind of profession standards. The other aspect, I mean, broader issues about conduct, that would fall more broadly under the code of conduct for public servants. I think those issues, but if we're looking at much more the technical aspects of it, I think the idea is not to ignore, but see how they could come together. So that even in that performance assessment, any kind of transgression or any complaint that is received by a professional body would also be taken into consideration. But that's my understanding, but certainly Dr. Maja might prove me wrong. So let me leave it there for now.
Okay, Dr. Maja.
Yes, no, I'm not going to prove you wrong. You are correct. I think the issue here, and I think it's one of the important elements of this professionalization framework. It's about consequence management. Now, here's the thing: we are introducing through this professionalization a second layer of consequence management. At the moment, we only have one layer of consequence management. It's between the employer and the employee. By professionalizing, we're introducing a second layer. And what this means is, if we say, and we put this in the rules and regulations through our sister department, the DPSA, to be a CFO in government, you have to be registered with CESA. It means then that is part of your employment contract. Now you misbehave. And when you misbehave, maybe your employer does not know about it or does not want to do anything about it, but CESA gets to know about it. And they institute disciplinary action against you, John, who is a CFO in Department X. Once, if that disciplinary action by CESA leads to your registration with CESA being withdrawn, it will then trigger action by your employer, because it means now you are no longer meeting the minimum requirements of your employment. Maybe I should stop there.
Okay, thank you very much for that response. Our next question, there's a notion of overuse of consultants at municipal departments and SOEs. How do we achieve the balancing act of professionalizing the public sector and sustaining private sector services? I think maybe Edwin and Zenith, we could ask you to come in on this.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the question is relevant based on experience, and obviously it will mean that there was an observation from the person who posted the question. Now, I think what needs to be answered here is on the how part, the balancing act of professionalization or professionalizing the public sector and sustaining the sector. I think in essence, what needs to happen is that government on its own, it needs to start looking at what I mentioned earlier on as meritocracy. People who are actually appointed on positions of influence, they must be appointed on merit, based on what they can be able to offer to the job. Because, okay, I'm just going to quickly give you an example of the angle that I'm trying to take here. There was a report, I really can't remember exactly where did I get it from, but it's in the public domain, whereby a study was done in terms of service providers, those who have been paid in time, vis-a-vis those who were delayed in getting their payments. It was actually mentioned that only in the Western Cape, service providers are actually being paid in time. Then that is one province out of 9. What about the rest of the other 8 provinces? You understand what I'm trying to say? So if you then look at it from that angle, you'll then realize that in actual fact, people who are in those positions, they really do not understand the effects in terms of how does that go in terms of dealing with businesses and sustaining businesses per se. Now, when I come back to the question, it's simple. Businesses need to sustain themselves to carry on. And for businesses to operate, they need the public sector and the SOEs to give them jobs. Therefore, we expect those businesses to be professionalized, to have people who've got the technical know-how in terms of service delivery aspects and what needs to be delivered. On the other side of government, we need people who can acknowledge, the impact that is coming from the businesses outside, so that once, services are being offered to the SOE or a department or municipality, then those people can be paid based on what they have done. So there needs to be balance on both areas. We need professionals for receiving services in the public sector. We need professionals in the public sector to be able to pay what is due to the public sector. Thank you very much. I don't know if I've answered the question.
Okay, no, I think you have. It's each side needs to understand the role that they play and fulfill that role. Zenith, can you contribute to that question as well?
So I agree with a few points that Edwin has raised. I think in terms of the question, maybe I'm understanding the question a little bit differently. So if I read it, there's a lot of consultants at municipal departments where people are not necessarily employed, but there's consultants that are employed to assist at state-owned enterprises as well as municipality to provide skills and training to the actual department. I think the question then becomes, why do you actually need a consultant? Which comes back to what Edwin was saying. If you are right for the job, it means that you have the necessary skills to undertake the work. There doesn't necessarily need to be a consultant there to further provide training and that sort of thing. But if you aren't, then obviously there's a need for consultants, and consultants come with their own issues in terms of their cost. They obviously get paid a lot more than employees do, and they get paid per rate per hour and that sort of thing. So it's about how do you curtail that cost, and how long is the duration? Are they there for specific items, or are they there just for a specific duration of time? And what are their needs to be there? And are those key performance indices being met and managed so that it doesn't become a long drawn out consultant in a position at a state-owned enterprise for a long duration of time, which costs a lot of money, and then you don't necessarily get the benefit in terms of training the juniors. So I think it's important for us to understand that. And the other item that Edwin raised was regards to how do you do sharing of resources and services. So I think it comes back to demand and supply. Private sector does need public to say, okay, these are items that we need to do and work that we need to procure and work needs to get done. And that's an exchange of value. So public sector comes and says, okay, this is work that needs to be done, and private sector needs to rise to the challenge and provide services. But I think there's a responsibility in private sector consultants when they're operating within the consulting space to offer services and information to public enterprises, not based on their own personal agendas, but rather on the needs of the actual public sector requiring the services.
Thank you, Zenith. Dr. Belvedere, would you like to come in?
Yes, thanks for that. I think I agree with the colleagues. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that if you look at some of the Auditor General's reports, is that a lot of consultants are being brought in to do the basic work of a municipality, the financial books. So in essence, we're paying twice. We are paying public servants, in principle, who occupy a position that should have those skills in the first place. And also the consultants to do the work that they are not doing. So I think that's the aspect we've got to think about in terms of when we think about recruitment and how do we make sure that we have people with the necessary skills and knowledge. I think certainly there's still room to have consultants where we would require much more like technical specific skills that might not be expected of, you're not going to get through your training or your pre-entry exam, or it might be something very specific and might be short term. But when it becomes the custom to pay consultants massive amounts of money just to do the basic work, core work that we are paying public servants for, then there's definitely an issue there. Thanks.
Yeah, I think you are spot on there, and I think we see the need for this professionalization coming through from these comments, and the impact of not having the proper skills at the required points. And each has their own role to play and should not be moving into the other space. If everybody is properly, if the professionalization takes place across the board. I think we have time for just one more question. With the professionalization of the state in respect of professionals, take into account duty to profession first and employer second. Dr. Marja, I'd like you to take this one.
The issue, if I understand the question, is about whether is it going to lead to it being a duty to the profession rather than just serving society. Am I right?
Correct.
Now, here's the thing that it can't be a duty to the profession because remember, government is there to serve the people. So the ultimate goal has to be service to the people. But, you know, sometimes also when we talk about professionalization and in particular, we mustn't present it as the be-all solution to our problems. One of the things we will have to do as we professionalize and we require of public servants to belong to professional bodies is to look inside the professional bodies themselves and understand clearly what is it that they're doing and how are they doing it, and deal with issues of gatekeeping, for example. How can we deal with the issue of gatekeeping so that more and more South Africans are professionalized in a way that they're able to serve society? So it has to be about serving the people and not a duty to the profession. And we must be careful not to super empower professional bodies at the expense of other areas of serving the people.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. I think ideally those two should work together and have the goals aligned as well. And then we would come through to still achieving the same objectives. Unfortunately, because we've run out of time, we were not able to go through the rest of the questions, but I hope that our panelists will still stay in the room and maybe address this on the general chat and continue the discussion even after this session. I'd like to just go through all the panelists and give you 30 seconds just to give us your parting shot. I think we'll go with Dr. Balvadier first.
Thank you very much, Naomi. I think it's been a very productive session. I think to understand as well how there are complementary ways in which the private sector and the public sector can work together. I think we got to keep pushing. I think as CESA, as PARI, as different sectors, I think we need to keep engaging with the National School of Government, with with a number of these initiatives to make sure that what we're building and what we're putting in place really serves the need of the people of this country and the principle of contributing to economic growth and really good service delivery. So I think we got to keep working. I think from where I'm sitting, I know not as an engineer, but certainly looking at the bigger picture, I think we've got to keep being vocal and making sure that we all contribute to putting together a proper systems and mechanisms. Thank you.
Mr. Baloy.
Thank you very much. Mine is not going to be that much. I just want to go back to the previous speaker who left us in what he said, specifically on the professional bodies themselves. There's a lot of red tape that we, as professionals and organizations like SAPTACO and CESA, we need to get engaged and break those walls. I'll put it to you straight. If you go to a professional body that registered people for professional status, it depends on who you find there and who you are. I've seen reports whereby one comprehensive report, it has been denied registration, but I look at them in terms of comparisons, you can see that the other one that actually the owner got registered, it was not supposed to be like that. So when you look at that, then you can see that there's still a lot of work that we're supposed to continue doing, as CESA and SAPTACO together. So it's our duty to make sure that our members, deserve to be represented, and also we get, the opportunity to talk to those issues. Other day, we can be able to unbundle. But in the parting shot, we must also prioritize transformation, across the board, so that, as we grow the country, everybody grows steadily, together, in advancing to be in the macroeconomy of the country, as the people of this country. That is what I can say in a parting shot.
For that. Zenith, your parting shot.
Thanks, Naomi. I think from the discussions that we've had, I think and a want for professionalization. And I think that's important to just hone in on, because if there was no need, there would be no discussion. If there is no discussion, then there's no opportunity for change. So I think the platform and the discussions need to continue. I think there needs to be key alliances in terms of private sector and public sector with regards to how we come together. And I think we've got a duty as the private sector as well to take the skills that we have and impart the knowledge. I was just thinking this morning when I woke up, I said, it's such an honor to be at the CESA in Indaba. Like when we were graduates and we just, starting out in our engineering careers, and we're so excited about being engineers, we'd always go to these organizations and these events. And never would I have thought that I would actually be speaking at these events, because, not only it does make me feel a bit old, like as a senior engineer, but it means that the older generation of engineers have given us the opportunity as the younger generation to then take the reins. And similarly, there needs to be an exchange of knowledge and values and lessons learned from our predecessors in terms of how they start firms and processes. And there's a lot that has been done. If you look at policy documents and if you look at the codes, just the simple thing of the codes and how detailed they were, there's so much of knowledge and information in there, and that knowledge and transfer of skills needs to be continuing so that there's continued growth. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Zenith. Just a parting shot from Dr. Maja. He unfortunately got dropped from the screen. His parting shot: we are in a race against time. We must sprint. And I agree with that. Thank you to all of you for sharing this session with us. Apologies for going into your lunch break. I do hope that it has been an informative one and broadened your perspective on this very critical issue. Essentially, ultimately, we all need to work together and drive this process to achieve complete professionalization within the state and private sector, and thus achieve the common goal of ensuring a good life for all citizens in our beautiful country, and prove Bloomberg wrong. Thank you so much. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you to your panel, to everybody, our online audience. Thank you for your comments and questions. We do apologize for, and this is completely Freudian, for eating into your lunch break. But please do feel free to remain connected during lunch. Visit our sponsor stands, and maybe if I could, just add a remark or two as you go and take your lunch is, we really should be seeing professionalization as a quality assurance of a competency, and it should never be a form of gatekeeping based on elitism, racism, or any other exclusivity. And I certainly agree with the collaborative approach. And then maybe a parting shot systemically, if we're going to fix and address the issues as raised by in the National Infrastructure Plan, NIP 2050, that Dr. Altman raised yesterday, then certainly we need a capable state coupled with a capable private sector. And the fact of the matter is that we're going to have to look at this a lot more systemically than I think our conversations have been. I will just share one last truth, and this is stats based on the Department of Basic Education, and that talks to the capacity constraints that are inherent in our system that should never have been there. For example, the study done by the Department of Basic Education, there's a diagnostic report, which was done a few years ago. It covers the period 2011 to 2019. And you may want to hold on to your seats here, because if we're looking at feedstock to professionalize the state and in the private sector, in public, in infrastructure delivery, we also have to bear in mind that we need doctors, we need accounting professionals, and all of us tend to fish in the same pond. And so the reality, unfortunately, is that between 2011 and 2019, of the 550,000 average number of students over that period that wrote matric, about 240,000 wrote maths. Of that 240,000, 30,000 achieved 60 to 100%. Now, here's the problem. 60 to 70% in the National Senior Certificate it creates a specific problem for most learners when they enter the tertiary education environment, and the likelihood of making it through a program where mathematics and science is a requirement is very slow. And if we whittle this down further, you find that only 15,000 then achieve the 70 to 100%, have achieved over those last 9 years, have achieved the 70 to 100% and have a greater chance of making it through a 3 or 4 year degree program in commerce, medicine, sciences, and engineering. And so I think systemically, we need to have a conversation about how do we fix the quality of our basic education and our early childhood development, so that 27 years from now, we are not sitting and having the same conversation. We have the ability, we have the people, and let's work on educating them to take the future of this country forward. With that, colleagues, we're going to break for lunch. It's 1:24. Since this is online, I'm going to appeal to you and to request whether we wouldn't consider shortening this break from 1 hour to 35 minutes and reconvene at 2 o'clock so that we can get through our program and finish on time. I think this is one of the advantages of an online version. You can eat and listen, but you still have a 35 minutes to just clear your mind and take care of a couple of other things. So, colleagues, if we can reconvene at 2 o'clock again, we would certainly be most appreciative of that. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch and your shortened break. Thank you.